Title: The Town That Disappeared Overnight, The Vanishing Road. Before we start, if you think you've seen every mystery out there, think again. This one isn't a ghost story, it's worse, because it actually happened. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself for one of the strangest disappearances ever recorded. The road to Araromi-Oke is quiet now. Too quiet. No signposts, no traffic, not even a trace of what used to be a small but thriving village, somewhere deep in the western countryside of Nigeria. For decades, locals whispered about it in hushed tones, a place where 300 people vanished overnight, leaving behind homes still warm from the fire, and breakfast bowls half filled with yam porridge. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just silence. It began on a humid evening in April 1957, when traders from nearby towns noticed something unusual. Smoke no longer rose from the direction of Araromi-Oke. Chickens stopped wandering in from the farms, and the familiar chatter of the market women was gone. A few men decided to walk the 5 miles down the dirt path to check on their neighbors. By dusk, they returned pale and trembling. "Everyone's gone," one of them muttered. "Everything's still there, but they're gone." The authorities at the time were slow to respond. Nigeria was still under British colonial administration, and rural disappearances weren't considered high-priority cases. When a colonial patrol finally arrived days later, they confirmed what the villagers had seen. No inhabitants, no livestock, no footprints, no wheel marks. Cooking fires were still warm, beds neatly arranged. The local school's attendance register was open to a half-filled page, with children's names trailing off mid-sentence, as if someone had been interrupted mid-roll call. For investigators, the scene made no sense. There were no signs of disease, conflict, or natural disaster. The nearby stream was calm, and the fields hadn't burned. It was as if time itself had stopped in Araromi-Oke. The regional officer in charge, Inspector Harold Wainwright, filed a brief report calling it a case of mass voluntary migration. But the problem was, no one knew where these 300 villagers had gone. No nearby town had seen a sudden influx of people. No refugee camps were opened. No family members from neighboring communities ever received word from their relatives again. It was as though the entire population had been erased. As the years passed, rumors began to fill the gaps the investigation had left behind. Some said the villagers had been taken, by raiders, by colonial forces, even by cultists. Others whispered about a forbidden ritual gone wrong. But behind every superstition was a simple, unanswered question. How could 300 people disappear without a trace? In the early 2000s, decades after the vanishing, a Nigerian historian named Dr. Bamidele Arowolo reopened the case. He wasn't a believer in myths. He wanted proof. He spent months combing through dusty archives in Ibadan and Lagos, looking for any record of Araromi-Oke. There were trade records from the 1940s showing the sale of cocoa and palm oil from a town of that name. Census reports from 1952 confirmed its existence. But after 1957, nothing. The name vanished from official maps. Dr. Arowolo interviewed the elderly in nearby villages. They remembered visiting Araromi-Oke in their youth, buying goods from its market. One woman recalled playing there as a child. When he asked her what happened, she simply shook her head. "We don't go near there anymore," she said quietly. "The land remembers what happened." He trekked to the supposed site of the village, guided by rough hand-drawn maps and the memories of aging farmers. What he found was chilling. A dense thicket of bushland with the faint outlines of foundations buried beneath moss and dirt. Clay walls eroded into the earth, fragments of pottery scattered like breadcrumbs. But one thing stood out, an old wooden signpost, half-rotted, with faded white paint that still bore the words Araromi-Oke Primary School. It was proof that something had once existed there, but not proof of what happened. In the 2010s, the story went viral again. Photos of abandoned huts and eerie landscapes began circulating online, accompanied by sensational headlines. The village that vanished without a trace. But local elders pushed back, saying the truth had been twisted for clicks. They argued the villagers didn't vanish. They relocated after a deadly drought. But even they couldn't say where they went. Every attempt to trace descendants ended in contradiction. One elder, Chief Akinbile, claimed his father had been part of a rescue group that entered Araromi-Oke days after it was discovered empty. According to him, they found a single object in the town square, a white laundry basket, overturned, filled with dirt, and nothing else. It was odd enough to remember, because no one in the village was known to use such a basket. Chief Akinbile said the men left quickly that day. They felt something was wrong. The air was heavy, he recalled, like something had just happened, something we were not supposed to see. Back in London, Colonial Archives offered another twist. A memo dated June 1957, found decades later, referenced unusual reports of evacuation and disappearance near Oke-Ila. The file had been marked classified. The section that might have explained what happened was missing, torn out. By this point, researchers were divided into two camps, those who believed in a logical explanation and those who suspected a deliberate cover-up. Could the villagers have been forced out by government policy, relocated for hidden reasons, or silenced after witnessing something? One historian argued that during the late 1950s, there were several secret relocations due to agricultural experiments and land redistribution projects. Another countered that such operations would have left paper trails. None existed. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger it got. Araromi-Oke appeared in every pre-1957 record and then completely vanished, as though the name itself had been erased from collective memory. And then came the most unsettling discovery. While reviewing aerial survey maps from 1956, a researcher noticed something disturbing. A dark circular mark near the coordinates of Araromi-Oke, large enough to cover several acres. The same location in 1958 showed dense forest. No clearings, no rooftops, no traces of settlement. It was as if nature had swallowed the town whole in less than a year. No landslide, no flooding, no recorded earthquake, nothing. 68 years later, the land where Araromi-Oke once stood remains uninhabited. Locals refuse to farm there. Travelers avoid the area, saying compasses spin strangely and phone signals cut off. Every government survey ends quietly, with no official statement. It's a story without a villain, a mystery without an ending. But one researcher, a young documentary filmmaker from Lagos, thinks the truth might be darker than folklore suggests. She recently uncovered a letter from 1957, signed by Inspector Wainwright himself, warning colonial administrators about a pattern of disappearances spreading beyond Oak. If her findings are correct, Araromi-Oke wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last. But that part of the story, the missing files, the silenced witnesses, and the strange letters, begins in Chapter 2, The Forgotten Files. If you thought Chapter 1 was unsettling, this is where the truth starts to crawl out of the shadows. Stay till the end. You'll need a moment to process what really happened to that town, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because this story is only getting darker. When documentary filmmaker Amara Bello opened that letter in 2018, the paper felt fragile. Decades old, the ink faded but still legible. It was a memo from Inspector Harold Wainwright, the British officer who had first investigated Araromi-Oke's disappearance in 1957. The letter wasn't addressed to the colonial government as she expected, but to a private London address belonging to a man named Dr. Charles Fenwick, a field researcher for a British agricultural company that operated across West Africa in the 1950s. At first glance, the letter seemed routine, reports of unusual resettlements and vanishing homesteads. But toward the bottom, one sentence stopped her cold. The situation near Oke-Ila follows the same pattern as the incidents near Bodo Creek in Owode. Immediate containment is advised. The same pattern. That meant there had been other disappearances, not just Araromi-Oke. Amara began digging into Wainwright's service records. He'd served in multiple colonial postings from 1952 to 1960, often in regions marked by unexplained relocations. But in 1958, just 1 year after the Araromi-Oke case, his name vanished from official rosters. No retirement notice, no transfer order, nothing. She filed access requests through the British National Archives, asking for any documentation of mass evacuations or rural disappearances under Wainwright's jurisdiction. 2 weeks later, she received a polite email reply. The files you requested are currently classified for national security reasons until 2057. national security for a missing village. Amara didn't stop there. She traveled to the western region of Nigeria, accompanied by her small film crew. The area where Araromi-Oke once stood was now dense with bush, thick vegetation swallowing what little remained. Locals refused to go near it after sundown. Some told her the soil was cursed. Others say that at night you could still hear faint drumming, like an old festival no one remembered anymore. Her guide, an elderly farmer named Baba Sunday, was one of the few who agreed to show her the exact location. As they walked through the overgrown paths, he pointed to faint mounds, the remains of buildings now reduced to earth. "Here," he said, kicking at the ground. This was the chief's compound. They stopped at the edge of a clearing, the light dim beneath a canopy of trees. The air grew still, and then Amara saw it, a rusted metal object half buried in the dirt. She brushed off the soil and pulled it free, a corroded nameplate, etched with the words, District Surveillance Department. She didn't know it at the time, but that nameplate wasn't supposed to exist. There was no record of any colonial surveillance office operating in that district. Back at her hotel, she checked government registries from the 1950s. Nothing. No mention of the department anywhere in National Archives. It was as if someone had built an entire operation that vanished as completely as the village it observed. 2 months later, Amara flew to London. Her investigation led her to the descendants of Dr. Charles Fenwick, the man Wainwright had written to in 1957. Fenwick's grandson, a retired civil engineer, agreed to meet her at a cafe in Oxford. He'd never heard of Araromi-Oke, but when she mentioned Wainwright's name, he froze. "My grandfather kept journals," he said quietly. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. Most of them were about soil and crop experiments, but there was one entry he always refused to talk about. He returned moments later with a small leather-bound notebook. Inside, yellowed pages detailed Fenwick's work for a company called Global Resources, which supposedly tested soil fertility in rural Nigerian communities. But as Amara flipped through the entries, she realized it wasn't agriculture they were studying. It was population control. One passage read, "The OK operation has entered Phase 2. The test population has been relocated to undisclosed coordinates. Wainwright reports minimal resistance. Local narrative will attribute disappearance to tribal superstition. Test population, relocated, local narrative." Amara's hands trembled as she read. The wording was clinical, detached, as if human lives were merely part of an experiment. She took photographs of every page, careful not to damage the fragile binding. When she looked up, Fenwick's grandson was watching her, his face pale. "My grandfather quit the company that year," he said. "He stopped talking about his work entirely, burned most of his notes before he died." Back in Lagos, Amara began connecting the dots. She discovered that Global Resources had ties to the British colonial government and private defense contractors. Several African historians had already accused them of conducting covert testing in the 1950s under the guise of rural development. It was alleged, though never proven, that they experimented with forced relocation and exposure to environmental agents to test resilience in tropical climates. If true, it would mean Araromi-Oke wasn't a mystery of folklore or supernatural myth. It was a cover-up of human experimentation. But before Amara could publish her findings, something strange began happening. Her laptop files started disappearing. Hard drives corrupted overnight. Her email account was hacked multiple times. She began receiving anonymous messages warning her to stop digging. One night, while reviewing footage in her studio, she noticed something odd. In one of the clips from the site, shot on a drone, a faint geometric shape appeared in the overgrowth, visible only from above. It wasn't random. The pattern resembled a large circle divided into 4 quadrants, almost like a testing grid. In the very ski, enter, an empty concrete slab. It matched the coordinates marked in Fenwick's journal, Phase 2 site. Amara tried to get in touch with government representatives, but no one returned her calls. Eventually, a senior archivist from Abuja reached out anonymously. He said he'd seen her footage, and he believed her. "The files exist," he told her, "but you'll never get access to them. They're locked under joint colonial agreements." When she asked him why, his voice lowered. Because the experiments didn't stop in 1957. He claimed there were at least 5 other locations across West Africa where similar population disappearances occurred, always recorded as voluntary resettlements. Each time, the same thing followed: restricted land, sealed archives, and total silence. Amara didn't want to believe it. She'd set out to document a ghost story, not uncover a human rights atrocity. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. The story of Araromi-Oke was never about superstition. It was about erasure. Weeks later, her documentary trailer went live. Within hours, it was trending. The town that disappeared overnight became a viral sensation, hailed as one of the most disturbing real-life mysteries ever told. But days before the film's scheduled release, Amara disappeared. Her crew said she'd left her apartment late at night, camera bag in hand, saying she was going to meet someone who had the missing file. She never came back. Police found her car 2 days later, parked near the same overgrown path that once led to Araromi-Oke. Inside, they discovered her camera, still recording. The footage showed her walking alone into the dark. She stops, looks ahead, and whispers, "They were here." Then the screen goes black. To this day, no one has reopened the investigation. The area remains uninhabited. Her documentary never aired. And the missing colonial files, the ones labeled Phase 2, are still sealed under British law, set to declassify in 2057, exactly 100 years after the disappearance. By then, everyone who might remember what really happened will be gone. They called it superstition. They called it folklore. But maybe, just maybe, it was evidence. And if you think this story ends here, wait until you hear about the second town, because sometimes the scariest mysteries aren't the ones we invent. They're the ones someone tried to erase.